Is it because multilateralism has failed to serve its purpose for individual countries, for individual actors? Or is it that the world has changed so dramatically that our old institutions are no longer fit for purpose? Or is it this Westlessness that we have been discussing today? Or is it something entirely different? Dr. Jaishankar, why don't I start with you, please?
Thank you. First of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me look at the two key concepts you mentioned, multilateralism and Westlessness. Now, I think clearly multilateralism has become weaker, and clearly Westlessness is in evidence. And I would suggest that there is a correlation between the two. It's not to say that multilateralism is solely dependent on the West, or the West has always been faithfully multilateral. I think it is not. But there is a relationship. So what has led to weaker multilateralism and Westlessness? I think the first point is we've seen in the last 20, 30 years economic rebalancing in the world. It was a question of time before economic rebalancing translated into political rebalancing. And we are seeing that. I mean, in 2008, G7, G8 became G20. I think that's the beginning of an era. It's not the last word. So if there's going to be political rebalancing, then clearly we are going to be in a transition era. The second is that there is no question the world is more nationalistic. And it's more nationalistic. The United States is more nationalistic. China is more nationalistic. Different countries in the world are. A lot of this nationalism has been electorally validated. And there are multiple reasons. I mean, there are countries where it's a sort of positive, assertive nationalism. In some cases, it's more insecure nationalism. But the fact is, a more nationalistic world obviously is a less multilateral world. The third is the West, which was, in a sense, the old order. I would say if you talk of Westlessness, there is a Westfulness, and no pun intended. But that era, I think the West was so sure that it would sort of extend into infinity, that it actually didn't cultivate broader constituencies of support in the rest of the world. And so when political rebalancing happened, I think today you can see the gaps, in a sense, and I say this, say between the West and the South. And bear in mind that large parts of the global South are actually democratic, and most of all, beginning with my country. So even though they share a lot of political values and beliefs, yet there is a very visible gap between the West and the South. To some extent, there's the dichotomy of interests and beliefs. A lot of countries didn't practice what they preached. So what happened was, when it came to multilateralism, the exceptions were so many over such a long period of time that I think the rules got weakened. And of course, it didn't help that the United Nations is far less credible than it has been in history, which of course is not entirely surprising, because when you think about it, in your daily life, there aren't too many things which are 75 years old and still as good as they were. So clearly there's something which needs to be done there. A lot of new challenges that the world faces, challenges of technology which were discussed, challenges of connectivity. I think these are not readily amenable to multilateral solutions. These are also less influenced by the West. So the Westfulness factor kicks in, Westlessness factor kicks in there as well. So I think all of these have been trends which have reinforced each other over a period of time. So we come to the other issue raised. So what do you do about it? I think for the West, if it is going to be less dominant in the world, you do what you do in politics. You create coalitions. You look for convergences. So if the multilateral system is not working well enough, you support it with plurilateral arrangements. You make new compacts. So I think those are, and those could be political, those could be security. Burden sharing is a term which has a specific connotation in this geography, but I think it's frankly a practical concept today in the world. I think issues like counterterrorism, maritime security are issues where there is need for greater global burden sharing. I would also say one of the challenges which the West will face is how to get out of the alliance mindset. I mean, it's the business of the West to mind its alliances. I'm not disputing that. But I think the reality of this new world is Western countries have to look beyond alliances and work with partners beyond alliances who will come from a different place with a different history. So how do you develop the mechanisms to work with such countries? So to sum up, really, I would say if you are looking at a more multipolar world, then clearly, how do you, to me, it's important that, and a multipolar world is a Westlessness world. It's important that a multipolar world requires actually more, not less multilateralism, so that there is greater stability, because at the end of the day, when we all speak about global rebalancing, what we don't want is imbalancing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaishankar. Just a quick follow-up on that, because you ended with this lovely line about a multipolar world requires more multilateralism, not less. To what extent do you think that even the focus of the Western democracies on the notion of the West and now Westlessness is in fact making it harder for them to find common ground with other countries which are from the global south, for example, which perhaps share some of those values? It's just that they don't necessarily call them Western values. We heard a little bit about this also in the previous panel.
Well, I think it would sort of depend on the issue. President Steinmeier reminded us earlier in the evening that the United States, for example, is focused much more on Asia than it used to be, much more on Asia perhaps than on Europe. So you've seen a sort of a nimbleness and American adaptability to a new global national security situation. On the other hand, I would say if you look at Europe, Europe has realized the importance of working with the global south when it comes to climate change. So I wouldn't say that one has necessarily been smarter than the other. I think it depends on the issue. I think both have done well in some areas, both have done not well in some areas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Paul Horvath, and I'm a guest of the U.S. delegation. I'd like to direct my comment or question to the distinguished Foreign Minister of India, and maybe ask you to expand on your, I believe is your second point, which is that the West was so sure of its infinite supremacy that it failed to explore other avenues of engagement with other parts of the world. I'm not so sure I agree with it, and indeed, I think one of the reasons, at least from the US perspective, that we may be in the mess that we're in, is there's many who believe that it was quite the opposite, that it was incredible amounts of engagement actually with India and China, China more on trade, India more on information technology, that got us to where we were. So maybe you could expand on that and explain it, because it's not something that I'm quite sure I understand.
Sure. Well, I was looking over a longer time frame, say post-Second World War, not just the last 10 or 20 years. And the reason I said that was, today, if you look at a rules-based order, if you look at democratic practices, you look at pluralistic societies, I think after 1945, one of the reasons why people thought that political democracy, market economy, pluralistic societies could be the universal norm was because a poor developing country which had just got its independence chose those options. So by India choosing those options, it took it out of it being a solely Western characteristic and made it much broader. And over a period of time, a number of other countries in the global south, in Asia and Africa, have followed suit. Now, when it comes today to a lot of these practices, I think it's important that if the standards and conversations and interests are narrowly West, then the tendency is to say, well, this is a Western problem. This is not a global problem. I mean, we've seen, when I was analyzing why is it multilateralism is weaker, why has Westlessness happened? Part of it is that the resort to conveniences. I mean, I'll give you an example. There was a period where we had a military dictatorship to the east of India and to the west of India at the same time. The one east of India got sanctioned in Myanmar. The one west of India ended up as a major non-NATO ally. So, so what happens is, in many ways, I would say the lot of the messages about values and beliefs and order and rules tended to be vitiated by the politics of the day. And I think what it did was, in a sense, there is today a constituency, I think, for the West beyond the West. I mean, if you ask me in India, and I think my colleague from South Korea, in a way, said it, perhaps not as explicitly as I'm saying to you. I think non-Western democratic societies have an interest in the West. They would not like to see the West weaken. For them, today, the West would be less dominant, but still an integral, indispensable part of a global multipolar society. And for that, I think you need, shall I say, much more conversations, more working arrangements. When it comes today to challenges like maritime security, counterterrorism, the whole lot of global commons management issues. I do think that the West would be better served finding partners beyond the West. And I think beyond the West is open to that.
Roland Paris.
Because historically, there is a reason why West and democracy were equated. But over a period of time, I think the West needs to outgrow that. Because today, more people live in non-Western democracies than in Western democracies. So, still, we are all creatures of habit. So we use shorthand formulations even if they are anachronistic. So I take your point, but I think part of Westlessness is a kind of, the West has to understand this larger rebalance, as I said, the rebalancing. The fact that even democracy today, there are people in other continents who own it and claim it as strongly as people in Europe or North America do.
I think
No, I'm part of the East, I'm part of the South, I'm part of the West, I'm universal. I'm India.
The senator's last.
Kashmir. You got two democracies, two very good allies. India, over 1 billion people. You got China, who's trying to shut down everything close to democracy. And India, you're moving forward. You're having elections. You got your problems like we do at home. But you've chosen the democratic path. When it comes to Kashmir, I don't know how it ends, but let's make sure that two democracies will end it differently. And if you can prove that concept here, then I think it's probably the best way to sell democracy.
Don't worry, Senator, one democracy will settle it. And you know which one.